So I've gathered ADP from a handful of the most popular fantasy platforms to collect basically an industry consensus ADP. And the platforms that I used are Sleeper, ESPN, Yahoo, Fantrax, CBS, and NFL.com. So all of the main redraft sites. And from this industry ADP, I have the worst pick in every round of fantasy drafts that you must avoid drafting. So looking at round one, I said this in my video yesterday, but there honestly isn't a pick that I'm completely against. Pretty much everyone is worth this first round ADP. But if I had to pick the worst pick in this round, that would be Ashton Jeanty, strictly because he has to be great this year to pay off at his RB6 ADP. I made the same call with Garrett Wilson last year, saying that he was the worst pick in the first round last year, and I was kind of right because he did not live up to his ADP at all, because you were already banking on him breaking out to be worth that first round ADP, and he did not break out. This is also a similar argument that we saw with Marvin Harrison Jr. last year, where his ADP was so high as a rookie that felt bulletproof that we couldn't account for the question of what if this doesn't go exactly right? And that is what it feels like with Ashton Jeanty this year at this ADP. In order for Jeanty to pay off, he needs to be a top 5 fantasy running back to even really feel good about this pick. Since 2020, the average stat line for a top 5 fantasy running back is roughly 330 touches, including about 55 to 60 total receptions, 1,700 total yards, 15 total touchdowns. The touches I'm not really concerned about. Jeanty will probably be upwards of 350 touches by the end of the year, and he should see 50 plus receptions because he has no competition for snaps or touches in that backfield, and they drafted him to use him. But the other two areas, yards and especially touchdowns, are a concern to me because of the offense that he's in right now. Getting to 1,700 total yards is probably going to be tough for Jeanty. That is roughly 12 to 1,300 on the ground and then another 4 to 500 through the air. He can probably get to 1,200 rushing yards on just pure volume alone and maybe get to 300 or 400 receiving yards, but there's not a lot of room for error there on the Raiders because if their offense is bad, drives are going to end fast, there will be fewer total plays per game, and just fewer opportunities for Jeanty to even get the ball. If the Raiders are constantly going 3 and out, or they get a first down and then go 3 and out, that is not enough for Jeanty to rack up yards every single week. And that is especially not good enough for him to score upwards of 15 total touchdowns, which is my biggest concern for Ashton Jeanty on a bad offense. If he comes out and puts up 1,500 total yards and 10 total touchdowns on 285 touches, which feels like a reasonable projection, that would have been good for RB10 last year, and I know that because that is quite literally James Conner's stat line last year as the RB10 overall. 1,500 yards, 10 total touchdowns. I call that a win for Ashton Jeanty's rookie year, but it still doesn't live up to his RB6 ADP. Like, what's the difference between Ashton Jeanty and Josh Jacobs, or Jonathan Taylor, or Bucky Irving, Kyron Williams, or even Chase Brown? All of those guys are going after Ashton Jeanty, but are mostly in better offenses, or at least have the history of elite production already. I don't think that Jeanty is a bad pick in the first round. I think he's still going to be a top 10 fantasy running back. His floor does feel pretty high, but that isn't good enough in the first round ahead of other top 10 running backs that you can get later in the second or even in the third round. Looking at round 2, the answer here is pretty easy. It is both of these quarterbacks. Do not take a quarterback in round 2 of your 1 quarterback fantasy football leagues. The opportunity cost is just too great there to where you're passing on top 10 running backs and wide receivers for the chance of a difference-making player at the most replaceable position in fantasy football. And Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, they are fantastic players. I would love to have them on my fantasy team, but not in the second round. By drafting them this early, you are expecting them to do what Lamar Jackson did last year, which was otherworldly production with 4,200 passing yards, 40 passing touchdowns, plus another 900 yards and 4 touchdowns on the ground. Absolute insanity for Lamar last year. But I highly doubt he's going to do that again this year. I do not expect him to be so efficient with his passing yards or touchdowns again, to where if he's at 3,700 passing yards and 35 touchdowns, which is still a great season for Lamar Jackson, but you've now lost the difference-makingness of his fantasy football production to where he's not very different than a handful of the other elite guys. Josh Allen last year actually wasn't really a difference maker at all. I mean, he was if you were facing like Kyler Murray or Patrick Mahomes or Justin Herbert or whoever else, but on a points per game basis, Allen was the same as Joe Burrow, the same as Baker Mayfield, and only 1 point per game better than Jaden Daniels and Jalen Hurts. And for most of the season, wasn't much different than Bo Nix either. So why draft Josh Allen in the second when you can get Jaden Daniels in the third, Jalen Hurts or Joe Burrow in the fourth? Baker in the 6th, Bo Nix in the 7th. That just doesn't make any sense. Think of it from a trade perspective. Would you rather have Bucky Irving and Bo Nix or Lamar Jackson and Tony Pollard? Would you rather have Ladd McConkey and Baker Mayfield or Josh Allen and Jerry Jeudy? That's the side you're giving up if you draft Lamar or Allen in the 2nd round, and the replacement option that you're getting at running back or wide receiver instead by not waiting on quarterback. Moving to the 3rd round, the one name that sticks out to me here is Jaxon Smith-Njigba, just because at wide receiver 13, that's just a little too rich for my taste, and he's the first wide receiver in drafts to where I kind of start to say, a lot of these guys are pretty much the same. The only difference with JSN, though, is that I think that while he has the same floor, he has a way lower ceiling than a handful of guys going behind him. I could easily see the path for Tyreek Hill being a top 5 wide receiver again, for Mike Evans being top 10 without Chris Godwin for most of the year, like he has for most of his career as well, for Garrett Wilson to be 2023 DJ Moore with Justin Fields, for Marvin Harrison to break out this year, for Devontae Adams to be great with Matthew Stafford, for DK Metcalf to be great with Aaron Rodgers. DJ Moore improves with a better Ben Johnson offense and an ascending Caleb Williams. Maybe not all of those things happen, but the narratives for how those wide receivers could be fantasy wide receiver 1s feel easier to tell than the narrative for how JSN does it. I am absolutely terrified of Sam Darnold at quarterback because I think all of his success last year was because of Kevin O'Connell and his amazing weapons around him rather than him all of a sudden just being fixed. I think when we throw him behind a worse offensive line with worse wide receiver weapons, we'll see more of the Sam Darnold that we knew before his time in Minnesota. And maybe Darnold is still just good enough to hyper-target Jaxon Smith-Njigba a ton as the clear wide receiver 1 on the team, but that's where JSN's floor comes into play, but I don't see the ceiling. I don't see how Darnold could turn JSN into a 1,300 to 1,400 yard guy with double-digit touchdowns and be a top 7 or 8 fantasy wide receiver. And if JSN is in that 1,100 yards, 7 to 8 touchdown range, on paper, you probably got back what you paid as a fringe wide receiver 1, but that won't feel tremendous on a weekly basis if he's averaging 14 to 15 PPR points per game, which is what 14 other wide receivers did last year from wide receiver 17 down to wide receiver 30. Guys like Stephon Diggs, Devonta Smith, Cooper Kupp, Jacoby Myers, Jerry Jeudy, Jordan Addison, Cortland Sutton, Jameson Williams, and DJ Moore were all in that 14 to 15 PPR points per game range last year. So if JSN is going to be in that huge tier again in 2025 with a bunch of wide receivers you could have gotten a round or two later, it just doesn't make sense to draft him in the 3rd when he is more of a floor play at wide receiver than a ceiling play. Now, similarly, the worst pick in round 4 is Garrett Wilson, who is in nearly the same situation as Jaxon Smith-Njigba, but with probably worse quarterback play on a worse team. And I know Wilson and Fields played together at Ohio State, whoop-de-doo, and Fields was the one to unlock DJ Moore as the wide receiver 6 in 2023, whoop-de-doo. Justin Fields is just objectively a bad quarterback who is a career 61% completion percentage passer and has never topped 2,600 yards in a season nor thrown for more than 17 passing touchdowns. You look at his preseason numbers this year, 4 completions on 9 pass attempts, 46 yards, 0 touchdowns. Now, I would write that off as just preseason numbers and a really small sample size, but when that tracks with literally every other year of data that we have from Justin Fields in the NFL, I can't sit here and say Justin Fields is going to finally be good with the New York Jets. And if he's not good, that's going to affect Garrett Wilson. But of course, people just point at DJ Moore's season with Justin Fields and assume Garrett Wilson can do the same thing. And I just think that you're wrong. DJ Moore with Justin Fields in 2023 paced for 140 total targets. Wilson's career low is 147 and his average is 156 targets. DJ Moore averaged 10.8 yards per target. Wilson's career high is 7.5 yards per target and his average is below 7. DJ Moore had 539 yards after catch. Wilson's career high is 442 and his average is under 400. DJ Moore scored 8 touchdowns that season. Wilson's career high is 7 and his average is 5. So in order to replicate DJ Moore's magical season with Justin Fields, Garrett Wilson would have to see pretty serious career highs in yards per target, yards after the catch, and touchdowns, all while probably seeing the fewest targets in a season in his career. So if we assume his production will be closer to his first 2 seasons without Aaron Rodgers, which were still 90-ish receptions, 1,100 yards, and a few touchdowns, that's not a bad season for an NFL wide receiver, but for fantasy football, that is not going to cut it for you in the third round. In 2022, he was the wide receiver 21, and in 2023, the wide receiver 26 on a total points basis. But on a points per game basis, he was outside the top 30 both years, averaging 12.5 fantasy points per game. And for reference, that is what Zay Flowers averaged last year as the wide receiver 36 in points per game, and Flowers is going 1 to 2 rounds later than Garrett Wilson. Just do not draft Garrett Wilson this year. Oh, but speaking of Zay Flowers, he is the worst pick to make in the 5th round. The reason being is that he offers you nothing in terms of season-long ceiling. Last year might honestly be the best season of Lamar Jackson's career passing-wise. He threw for almost 4,200 yards and 41 touchdowns. He averaged 8.8 yards per attempt, 245 passing yards per game, 66% completion percentage. He was phenomenal as a passer, so we'd think that that would translate down to his wide receiver 1 also having a phenomenal year too, right? No, wrong. In the same year, his quarterback threw for 4,200 yards and 41 touchdowns, and he played all 17 games. Zay Flowers didn't even break 1,100 yards and only scored 4 times on 74 receptions. As I already mentioned, he averaged 12.5 PPR points per game as the wide receiver 36 in points per game and the wide receiver 25 overall. And he is being drafted as the wide receiver 25 off the board. So congratulations. If he did what he did last year, you're getting exactly what you pay for. But are you happy with that? What if Zay's production drops a little because Lamar's production regresses a little? I mentioned earlier, what if Lamar drops to 3,700 yards and 35 touchdowns, which is still a great season for Lamar and a good season passing-wise for the Ravens, but when you shave 500 yards and 6 touchdowns off this team, where is that production being taken from? Probably Mark Andrews for touchdowns, probably Zay Flowers for receiving yards. I don't see any sort of ceiling with Zay Flowers, and he is the most mediocre pick that you can make in the 5th round, especially when you're passing on other wide receivers like Cortland Sutton or Devonta Smith or Jameson Williams, George Pickens, Ted McMillan, Calvin Ridley, either Chiefs wide receiver, even Jalen Waddle and Travis Hunter have a way higher ceiling with a floor that doesn't feel much different than Zay Flowers. I don't understand the thought process behind drafting Flowers in the 5th when there are so many equally or perhaps just better talents at the same position in better situations that will give you better production. This video is presented by Yahoo Fantasy. We're running out of time, folks. Draft season is almost over, and we here at 4for4 are already in full prep mode. This year on 4for4, we are playing on Yahoo Fantasy, and you should too. Whether you're a first-timer or a veteran creating your millionth league, it is the platform that we trust every season for smooth drafts, solid tools, and easy league management. With season kickoff on September 4th, now is the time to start playing Yahoo Fantasy Football, which offers so many fun ways to compete. Want more ways to play? Try the brand new Yahoo Fantasy Guillotine League mode, where the lowest scored team gets eliminated each week until one team is left standing. Want to play instantly with friends? Try the new Draft with Friends mode. Prefer the classics? Get your crew together and go head-to-head in a private league. No crew? No problem. Join a public league, the easiest way to play fantasy football. Play now at yahoofantasy.com/teamapp. That is yahoofantasy.com/TMAP. Heading into the 6th round, I actually like pretty much all of these players that identifying who the worst pick is actually kind of difficult. But if I had to choose just to keep the Ravens train going, I think I have to pick Mark Andrews here, which does make me sad because I don't mind drafting him this year and having him as your every week starter. But out of everybody in this round, the 6th round just feels a little rich, and Andrews feels like the lowest ceiling player on the decline of his career. And as I highlighted multiple times already, if Lamar does regress in total touchdowns this year, the most likely candidate to regress with him is Mark Andrews, who set a career high in touchdowns last year with 11, where in the 4 years prior, he averaged more like 7 touchdowns per year. So if he does the same thing as he did last year, this year, but with 4 fewer touchdowns, he drops from the tight end 6 in PPR leagues down to tight end 10, which yes, technically still a top 10 fantasy tight end, but that is well within the range of players who just don't matter for fantasy football and is no different than about 10 other tight ends. If he drops to averaging 10 PPR points per game, that is the same range as Zach Ertz, Pat Freiermuth, Tucker Kraft, Hunter Henry, Cade Otton, Evan Ingram, and Dallas Goedert last year, and it is actually 3 fewer points per game than Mike Gesicki in games without T. Higgins. So it's all of those guys who are just good enough to be on your fantasy rosters, but no one that you have tremendous confidence in every week to where you're better off streaming matchups than picking a true set it and forget it guy from this entire list. I want to be in the camp that believes that as long as Mark Andrews is healthy and on the field, he's going to contribute well for fantasy football and be closer to a top 5 guy every week because he is Lamar Jackson's best friend. But I also see all the ways that it could go wrong this year. Isaiah Likely takes another step forward. Rashad Bateman takes another step forward. Zay Flowers becomes more involved in year 3. Derrick Henry scores more inside the 10. The Ravens as a team don't score 65 times again as a top 3 NFL offense this year. They dropped to 55 total touchdowns as a top 6 NFL offense. And shaving 10 total touchdowns off the entire pie, again, it's probable that some of those come from Mark Andrews' slice. In a round with so many other phenomenal options at other positions, plus the other tight ends that you can get later like Evan Ingram, David Njoku, Tyler Warren, and Tucker Kraft, it makes no sense to draft Mark Andrews here in the 6th round. Looking at the 7th round, the low-hanging fruit here is, of course, Joe Mixon, who has probably become the worst pick in all of fantasy football drafts this year. Even in the double-digit rounds, I am not touching Joe Mixon. He is completely off my board because I don't even think that he plays at all this season, and he may never even play again in the NFL. So do not draft Joe Mixon at all, and especially not when you see him on your platform's ADP list this high in the 7th round. Now, Joe Mixon aside, the other worst pick in this round is Kyler Murray, because the more and more that I watch Kyler and I watch this Cardinals passing offense, the more out I get on Kyler Murray. The dream, I think, is honestly over. The dream of him being an elite NFL quarterback, an elite fantasy quarterback, died with his knee injury a couple years ago, and I think his time as a starter in the NFL is ticking because he just does not move the needle. What makes things even worse for Kyler Murray this year is that nothing has changed for them from 2024 to 2025. It's the same head coach, same offensive coordinator, same receivers, same tight ends, same running backs. Everything is the same. The Cardinals front offense looked at their 2024 performance with 18th in passing yards, 22nd in passing touchdowns, 16th in yards per attempt, 12th highest in percentage of drives ending in a turnover. They saw all of that and they said, yeah, we're okay. We're okay with this mediocrity. It is such a mediocre offense and a big part of the reason why I'm skeptical for Marvin Harrison's breakout this year, and it all stems back to the offensive system in place and even Kyler Murray. So because everything's exactly the same, how can we expect anything different than what we saw last year? Where yes, in total points, Kyler was the quarterback 10 on the season because he played all 17 games, but on a points per game basis, he was the quarterback 12 and no different than Sam Darnold, Patrick Mahomes, Brock Purdy, Tua, and Justin Herbert, all of whom were plus or minus 1 point per game from Kyler Murray last year. And that doesn't even include Drake May producing similarly from week 6 on once May actually took over as the starter, or Jordan Love outproducing him to start the year until his week 8 injury, or Justin Fields outproducing him until he was benched, or Jared Goff and Bo Nix just straight up outproducing him all season long. So if Kyler was no different or even worse than like 9 other quarterbacks, most of whom you can get later in your drafts, why would you ever draft Kyler as the quarterback 9 off the board? Draft Purdy, Dak Prescott, Jared Goff, Justin Fields, Justin Herbert, Jordan Love in the 9th or 10th rounds. Draft J.J. McCarthy in the 11th round. Maybe Trevor Lawrence does well under Liam Cohen. You can get him in the 12th round. There's just so many other options for quarterbacks who have just as high or even higher ceilings and the exact same floor. That there's literally zero reasons to ever draft Kyler Murray in the 7th or even in the 8th round. Now, looking at the 8th round, this one is just painfully obvious who the worst pick is, to the point where if Joe Mixon is not the worst pick in all of fantasy this year because his ADP has actually plummeted from all the news of his injuries, then Cooper Kupp is the worst pick in fantasy this year because people are actually drafting him in the 8th round for reasons I cannot even comprehend. Take all of the reasons that I'm skeptical about Jaxon Smith-Njigba in the 3rd round because of Sam Darnold and the bad offensive line, but multiply that by 10 because JSN is actually a really good receiver right now in his career, whereas Cooper Kupp might be in his Robert Woods on the Titans era, his AJ Green on the Cardinals era, his Jarvis Landry on the New Orleans Saints era, that point in his career. Over his last 7 games with the Rams last year, including 2 playoff games, Kupp totaled 31 targets, 19 receptions, 252 yards, and 1 touchdown. That is a 17-game pace of 46 receptions, 600 yards, and 2 touchdowns on 75 targets. That was on a playoff Los Angeles Rams team with Matthew Stafford at quarterback in a Sean McVay offense as the wide receiver 2 on the team. Now imagine what Kupp will do on a non-playoff team in Seattle with Sam Darnold at quarterback and a Clint Kubiak offense as the wide receiver 2 on the team. The amount of assumptions that you have to make to believe that Kupp can even be a viable flex option for you every week is just baffling to me. You have to believe that Kupp himself is not washed, and at the end of last year was just this weird fluke where Puka was just really good, Kyren was so effective on the ground that they just didn't need Cooper Kupp at all to win games. And they did go 6-1 in those final 7 games. That is the most important thing that you have to believe about Cooper Kupp right now, because if he actually is washed, none of the rest of the things that I say are even going to matter. He's actually just cooked and won't produce no matter the other circumstances. You also have to believe that Sam Darnold is somewhat fixed from his time in San Francisco and Minnesota, that he is capable of supporting multiple fantasy receivers as top 36 guys, even in a more run-first offense that Seattle wants to be. Or you have to believe that Clint Kubiak can at least work his system well enough in his first year in Seattle that Darnold's weaknesses are hidden and the system works well enough to then support multiple top 36 guys for fantasy. Or as a last-ditch hope, maybe Sam Darnold just actually isn't good, and then Jalen Milroe takes over, is better, and can support multiple top 36 guys for fantasy as a more mobile quarterback in a more run-first offense. Do you see how crazy all of that is to even believe a couple of those things are true for Kupp to then pay off at this ADP as a borderline top 40 wide receiver off the board? Not even mentioning that he's going in the same round as Ricky Pearsall, the probable wide receiver 1 for San Francisco, Deebo Samuel, the wide receiver 2 or maybe even 1B in a really good Commanders offense, Jordan Addison, the wide receiver 2 for a good Vikings offense with 2 top 24 seasons already under his belt, Emeka Egbuka, the wide receiver 2 for Baker Mayfield, Matthew Golden, the probable wide receiver 1 for Jordan Love, Khalil Shakir, the possible wide receiver 1 for Josh Allen. Just none of this makes sense for why Cooper Kupp is valued in this range. Say you even want to draft an older veteran with a history of production, but probably isn't the wide receiver 1 on his team and in a weird quarterback situation right now. If you want that guy, then take Michael Pittman 2 rounds later. Take Christian Kirk 4 rounds later. There's literally zero reason to ever draft Cooper Kupp in the first 10 rounds, let alone in the 8th round, with all of those other way better, way younger, with way more upside options on the board that are just going to be so much more valuable to your team than maybe, hopefully, getting 10 to 12 points per game from Cooper Kupp. Into the 9th round now, the low-hanging fruit here is Quinshon Judkins. I mean, number one, he's still not even under contract with the Cleveland Browns, and it seems like they're waiting for the NFL's investigation process to finalize before even signing him. So who knows when that's going to happen. And then number two, even when he does sign a contract, he's probably going to get suspended. So how long all of this takes, how long his suspension is, I have no idea, but it doesn't seem like it's going to be happening anytime soon. So why draft a guy that you probably can't even put on your IR? So he's just eating up a roster spot in the most valuable time of the year to be wanting good players on your bench and have a willingness to add guys making impacts early in the season. And if you draft Quinshon Judkins in the 9th, you might feel beholden to keep him over the top waiver wire guys that you might pick up in weeks 1, 2, or 3 that could actually make a difference for your team. So I am not drafting Quinshon Judkins in the 9th round. I'd much rather wait and take Dylan Sampson or Jerome Ford, or just keep that roster spot open for somebody who's actually going to produce early in the season. The other easy name here is Brian Robinson. ADP can be really slow to catch up to rapidly changing news and trades, and if you draft on ESPN or Sleeper or NFL.com, you might see Brian Robinson's name up pretty high in this kind of range, even though he's not a starting running back anymore. So do not draft Brian Robinson in the 9th round, even as the handcuff to Christian McCaffrey. Then as we get into the double-digit rounds, it kind of gets harder to say players are the worst pick in a round when you get this late in drafts. I think there are better and more optimal picks to make this late, but making a negative case for someone that we already don't really think highly of is kind of hard to do. In this round, I don't love Caleb Williams or CJ Stroud here just because I just think that they're kind of bleh options at the quarterback position, especially when you compare them to Drake May and Jordan Love in this same round. I also don't love Dalton Kincaid here. He's a tight end 13 off the board and was the tight end 20 in points per game last year with 2 games over 10 PPR points. By comparison, Dallas Goedert in this same round had 5 double-digit PPR games last year in 10 games played. So take Dallas Goedert, don't draft Dalton Kincaid. So those are players that I believe are the worst picks in the first 10 rounds of fantasy football drafts. But if you want to see all the players that I am targeting in every single round that I think are the best picks in rounds 1 through 10, including some of my favorite late round targets, then you can check out this video right up here.